Audrey Conroy and Alaric Faulkner were once the golden couple of Edinburgh, admired by all. As fiancés, everyone expected them to fulfill their engagement soon. However, 6 years passed, and the wedding was repeatedly postponed. Alaric Faulkner only waited to see Audrey Conroy return to the country with another man, even hurting herself repeatedly for his sake. When his grandmother fell critically ill, Alaric had no choice but to rush into a marriage. As they walked out of the register office after obtaining their marriage certificate, Alaric Faulkner couldn't help but think. It turns out getting married is quite simple, as long as the person isn't Audrey Conroy. Ding! Story Shots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. Turns out, getting married only takes 10 minutes. Walking out of the register office, Alaric Faulkner stared at the small red book in his hand, still feeling a bit dazed. He was really married now, not to his fiancée Audrey Conroy, but to a stranger he had met less than a week ago. "I'm sorry, Dr. Faulkner. This mission came up quite suddenly. Can we hold our wedding ceremony in a month?" The apologetic voice beside him drew his attention to her. In the sunset, the woman's features were delicate, but she lacked the typical girlish demeanor. Instead, she exuded a sense of decisiveness and sharpness. Her posture was straight, composed when still, and unstoppable when in motion, like a sword being unsheathed the bearing of a soldier. This was his new wife, Agatha Cornwell. "It's all right," Alaric nodded understandingly. "Your mission takes priority." Agatha smiled, stepping forward to give Alaric a quick hug. "Then, as we agreed before, we'll have the wedding ceremony in York in a month. I'll come back for you when my mission is complete." The embrace was brief, the crisp scent at the tip of his nose vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Before Alaric could react, she had already hurried away. Took a minute for Alaric to accept the fact that he was married. He tucked the marriage certificate into his pocket and hailed a taxi home. The house was still empty when he arrived. Alaric ignored this, heading straight to the master bedroom to pack his things. He and Audrey had been betrothed since childhood, so it had been appropriate for him to live in her house. Now that he was married to someone else, he should leave as soon as possible. Just as he found his suitcase, a questioning voice came from the doorway. "Where are you going?" Alaric looked up to see Audrey Conroy, who hadn't been home for half a month, standing at the door. She had her suit jacket draped over her arm and was rubbing her temples, her face, despite the meticulous makeup, showing signs of exhaustion. "Alaric, I've been very busy lately. Please don't pull any more of these running away stunts. I don't have time to humor you. It was always like this." Every time she spoke to him, it was with such impatience, as if she was specially setting aside time to check on him. He was really leaving this time, but she thought he was just making a scene. Alaric didn't want to explain much. He kept his eyes down, folding clothes as he spoke. "The hospital is sending me on a trip to Bath in a few days. I'm preparing in advance." Realizing she had misunderstood, Audrey's hand paused as she rubbed her temples. Her expression softened a bit as she advised. "Bath is colder than here. Make sure to pack some warmer clothes." Watching Alaric rummage through the wardrobe for clothes, Audrey hesitated for a moment before saying, "Alaric, I still need to bring Bertram and his son to live here. Barnaby's registration needs to be under my name as well. You know they have no one else in the UK, and they've done me a great service." Before she could finish, Alaric turned and interrupted her. "I have no objections. Go ahead and bring them here." He was about to leave anyway. Whoever moved into this house after that was none of his business, nor did he want it to be. Bertram Cargill and his son Barnaby were Audrey's saviors, and even great benefactors to the entire Conroy group. 6 months ago, Audrey had gone missing during a business trip to the United States after unfortunately encountering a terrorist attack. It wasn't until a month ago, at Audrey's grandmother's 70th birthday celebration, that she suddenly reappeared, accompanied by Bertram Cargill and his son. On that day, when all of Edinburgh's elite families had gathered, his fiancée had arrived arm in arm with another man, introducing him to everyone. That day, he became the laughingstock of all Edinburgh. Afterwards, Audrey had explained to Alaric that she only felt gratitude towards Bertram, grateful for his courage and resourcefulness in saving her and protecting the company's confidential documents. But Alaric could see clearly that the way she looked at Bertram was far from innocent. The deep affection in her eyes couldn't be faked. In the past, he would have defended his territory like a male lion, preventing Bertram from entering this place. Now he wouldn't. Audrey hadn't expected Alaric to agree at all. A flicker of surprise passed through her eyes. Pleased by his compromise, Audrey explained in a softer tone, "Don't worry, Alaric. Once Bertram gets familiar with the UK and finds a job, he'll move out." Alaric wasn't concerned about Bertram's affairs. Instead, he said, "About our engagement." But Audrey didn't want to hear it and cut him off. "The company is very busy lately. Let's talk about the wedding some other time." Alaric tried to explain, "I'm not." But before he could finish, Audrey's phone rang. The moment she answered it, her eyes softened. "Bertram, what is it? Barnaby misses me? I'll be right there." She hurried towards the door as she spoke. Only when she reached the doorway did she seem to remember Alaric, adding a quick instruction. "Alaric, please tidy up the guest room before tomorrow. Bertram and Barnaby will be moving in." A moment later, the front door clicked shut, leaving Alaric alone with the overwhelming sense of loneliness. Alaric lowered his gaze to his hand, which he hadn't had time to withdraw. He tugged at the corner of his mouth, his eyes dimming. "I wasn't talking about the wedding. I wanted to break off the engagement." When exactly had Audrey lost patience to listen to him? She always looked at him impatiently now, as if talking to him had become something she despised. But she hadn't always been like this. The Faulkners and the Conroys had been close family friends for generations. Alaric Faulkner and Audrey Conroy grew up together, with a childhood engagement that made them the golden couple of Edinburgh's elite circles. They had grown up side by side, never explicitly expressing their feelings for each other, but she was always there when he turned around. She was a few years older than him and had always protected and supported him, like a guardian angel. Originally, they were supposed to get married as soon as he reached the legal age, as it seemed natural and expected. However, tragedy struck when Alaric was 16. His parents died in a car accident, and the Faulkner family business was seized by his unscrupulous uncle and aunt. They brazenly moved into the Faulkner mansion, treating Alaric like a servant and even abusing him. In his darkest hour, it was Audrey Conroy who protected him, taking him into her home and caring for him. This allowed him to finish his studies and eventually become a doctor. After graduating from university, Alaric wanted to fulfill their engagement and create a small family of his own with Audrey. But as she took over the family business, she became increasingly busy, always asking him to wait a little longer. He waited for 6 years. Audrey's attitude changed from patient and gentle to frowning at the mere mention of marriage. Alaric thought she was just tired and believed he should be more understanding, not wanting to pressure her. As long as she loved him, what harm was there in waiting a bit longer? Until Bertram Cargill appeared, shattering all of Alaric's illusions. It turned out Audrey could meticulously arrange someone's daily life without finding it troublesome. It turned out Audrey could inquire about someone's daily routine every single day, worried they might feel neglected. These were things Audrey had never done for Alaric. The sharp ring of his phone broke through his reverie, the bitterness stabbing at his heart. Alaric looked up at the ceiling, holding back his tears. "Dr. Faulkner, we've just had a patient with a ruptured liver hemangioma come into A&E. All the experienced doctors are in surgery. If you're available, could you take this one?" It was a call from the operating theater. Alaric immediately stood up. "Prepare everything. I'll be right there." He arrived at the hospital at 9 p.m. Due to the patient's critical condition, Alaric performed a partial hepatectomy. By the time he left the operating theater, it was already 2 a.m. Exhausted and drowsy from the long, intense surgery, Alaric fell asleep in his office clothes as soon as he returned to his office. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when he vaguely felt something being draped over him. Opening his eyes, he saw Dr. Beatrice Weir, the hospital director, standing in front of him. "Alaric, did I wake you? I saw you curled up here without even a blanket, so I thought I'd cover you up a bit. I didn't mean to disturb you." "Oh dear." Dr. Weir looked a bit flustered. Alaric didn't mind. "It's all right, Dr. Weir. I've had enough sleep. I'll do my rounds and then go home for a proper rest." Dr. Weir was not only Alaric's superior but also a friend of his father's. Over the years, she had witnessed how hard this young man had worked. Dr. Weir felt both proud and concerned. "All right then, do your rounds quickly and get some rest at home." She turned to leave the office. Alaric hesitated for a moment before calling out to Dr. Weir. "Dr. Weir, I'd like to submit my resignation." Dr. Weir immediately turned back, her voice filled with surprise. "Why? Why so suddenly? I got married." Hearing this, Dr. Weir's face lit up with understanding and a smile. "Oh, to the Conroy girl, isn't it? Congratulations, Alaric. Your childhood bond has finally come to fruition." Seeing Dr. Weir's misunderstanding, Alaric gave a slight, forced smile but didn't explain. Not noticing Alaric's unusual reaction, Dr. Weir continued excitedly, "Your grandmother has always wanted to see you married, hasn't she? The old lady can finally rest easy now." At the mention of his grandmother, Alaric's eyes softened, and this time his smile was genuine. "I hope it will make her happy too. If it weren't for his grandmother's last wish to see him settled down, he wouldn't have rushed into marriage with Agatha Cornwell, who was also under pressure to get married. Next time he visits his grandmother with the marriage certificate, she'll be overjoyed, won't she?" After chatting with Dr. Weir for a while, Alaric went to complete his resignation paperwork and then did his rounds before heading home. Having worked through the night and not rested well, Alaric felt lightheaded and weak on the taxi ride home, longing to crawl into bed for a good sleep. But the moment he entered the house, the scene in the master bedroom sent all the blood rushing to his face, his exhaustion and drowsiness instantly replaced by fury. "Barnaby, what are you doing?" Snatching the frame from the little boy's hands, Alaric Faulkner felt his vision blur as he saw the beautiful oil painting now marred by thick black scribbles. His hands trembled uncontrollably. This was the only memento left by his mother. This painting had accompanied him through so many days and nights, and now it was ruined. Alaric's chest heaved with anger as he glared at Barnaby. But before he could say anything, the little boy started wailing at the top of his lungs. "Wah! Uncle Alaric, you're so scary. Daddy, come quick. Uncle Alaric is going to hit me. I'm so scared." The next moment, Bertram Cargill rushed in, quickly taking his son into his arms to comfort him. "Oh, Daddy's little darling, what's the matter?" After a few soothing words, he seemed to finally notice Alaric standing behind him and said in a neither friendly nor hostile tone, "Dr. Faulkner, Barnaby is just a child. Whatever he's done wrong, whatever he's damaged, I'll compensate for it all. I'll take full responsibility. Surely you, as an adult, won't hold a grudge against a child, will you?" Bertram Cargill was a British citizen of American descent, with slightly long, curly blonde hair and gentle, handsome features that made him look like a harmless puppy. But as he spoke, there was no real apology in his words, and his eyes held a malicious challenge as he looked at Alaric. Alaric's temples throbbed as he held up the frame and demanded angrily, "Who gave you permission to enter my room and damage my belongings? You'll compensate? How do you plan to do that?" Barnaby, hiding behind Bertram, barked defiantly like a little dog emboldened by its owner's presence. "It's just a stupid old painting. I'll get Uncle Aubrey to pay for it, you stingy ugly man. No wonder Aunt Audrey doesn't like you and likes my dad instead." Alaric's eyes turned red with anger as he reached out to discipline Barnaby himself. Bertram glanced sideways, his brow twitching slightly as he roughly pushed his son, causing him to crash into the bedside table. "Ah, Daddy, it hurts. I'm bleeding." A childish scream rang out as Barnaby sat on the floor crying incessantly, a large gash on his forehead with blood trickling down his small face, looking quite severe. Bertram immediately went to help his son, holding him tenderly as he said to Alaric, "Dr. Faulkner, even if Barnaby really angered you, there was no need to lay hands on such a young child, was there? Can't you accept my apology?" Alaric had clearly seen Bertram's actions just now, and hearing this, he frowned instinctively, not understanding what game Bertram was playing. But in the next moment, Alaric understood. "Barnaby!" Audrey Conroy came running in on her high heels, crouched beside Barnaby to take a look, then turned to glare at Alaric, her voice cold. "Alaric Faulkner, Barnaby is just a child. How could you bear to hurt him?" Hearing Audrey accuse him without discerning right from wrong, Alaric felt his entire heart freeze as he clutched the painting in his hands. All strength left his body in an instant. His throat parched, all explanations stuck in his throat. Bertram, however, spoke up for him through tears. "Audrey, we can't really blame Dr. Faulkner for this. It's all because my son and I mistook his room for the guest room. Back in America, we always lived in basements, so when we saw this room with good lighting, we couldn't resist choosing it. Barnaby even touched Dr. Faulkner's painting. That's why he got angry." Bertram's words sounded pitiful, immediately arousing Audrey's sympathy. She turned to look at Alaric with even more anger in her eyes. "It's just a worthless painting. Was that worth hitting someone over? Alaric Faulkner, you really have a temper. Apologize to Bertram and Barnaby right now." A worthless painting? This was the only memento his father had left him. Bertram might not know, but surely Audrey did? Alaric looked up at Audrey, his fingers tightly gripping the frame. "I won't apologize. I didn't push Barnaby." Audrey grew even angrier, her pretty face tense as she shouted, "Even now, you refuse to admit your mistake." Bertram, however, held her sleeve, saying understandingly, "Let it go, Audrey. If Dr. Faulkner doesn't want to apologize, then so be it. After all, we did disturb his life suddenly. He has the right to be angry." But the more he spoke like this, the more Audrey felt that Alaric's expressionless face was unacceptable. She frowned and gritted her teeth. "There's no justification for such anger. An outsider has no right to dictate arrangements in my home. From now on, Bertram, you and Barnaby will move into this master bedroom. Let him move to the guest room." The words pierced Alaric Faulkner's heart like a dagger, causing him to stagger. An outsider? After all these years, was that all he was to her? Just an outsider? How laughable! Bertram Cargill, hearing Audrey Conroy's words, felt a spark of joy in his heart. But his face showed only concern as he said, "There's no rush about the room. It's just that Barnaby's wound is quite serious. Audrey, could you come with me to take him to the hospital for treatment?" With that, Bertram picked up Barnaby Cargill from the floor. Audrey didn't hesitate, taking out her car keys and following them out. Alaric called out to her, his face expressionless, "Audrey Conroy, let's end our engagement." Audrey didn't believe a word of it, thinking he was still playing games. Without turning back, she said, "All right, stop with these silly tricks. Stay home and reflect on your behavior." With that, Audrey hurriedly left with Bertram and his son. As the door closed, Alaric felt all strength leave his body. He crouched down, hugging the oil painting as if it were his whole world. The heat rising in his eyes dampened his entire heart, clogging his nose and mouth, making it difficult to breathe, his vision blurring. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there when his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a friend request from Bertram Cargill. Alaric accepted it, but no message came through from the other side. At that moment, a message from a colleague popped up. "Dr. Faulkner, I've got a Facebook post that needs likes. Could you help me out, please?" Alaric exited the message screen and scrolled through his feed looking for that post. But his attention was caught by Bertram's recent update. It was a series of photos showing Audrey sitting by a hospital bed, peeling an apple for Barnaby. The caption read, "Thank you, fate, for bringing you into my life." Alaric clicked on it, only to discover it was a live photo with background audio. The conversation between Bertram and Audrey was clearly recorded. Bertram's voice was slightly worried. "Audrey, is everything all right with Dr. Faulkner?" I saw him packing earlier. What if he gets angry and moves out? Audrey's tone was dismissive, even mocking. He's just an orphan. Where else would he go? At most, he'll run off to do surgery somewhere else. I've seen this trick many times. Alaric closed his phone and closed his eyes, laughing bitterly. How pathetic he was. All those touching moments when she had stood up for him in the past now felt like boomerangs stabbing into his soft spots. The barbs dug deep into his bones, piercing his vulnerabilities. For the next week, Alaric worked overtime at the hospital, never returning home. He was indeed very busy, not only needing to clear his previously scheduled surgeries but also dealing with a major fire that had occurred in central Edinburgh. The number of patients requiring surgery had skyrocketed, and all the surgeons were run off their feet. "Good work, Dr. Faulkner." Alaric nodded to his colleague as he removed his mask and changed out of his surgical gown. He returned to his office, not even having time for a sip of water before Bertram Cargill arrived with Barnaby. "Dr. Faulkner, please, I'm begging you, don't make me and Barnaby leave." The young nurse who had shown them in hadn't even left the office before Bertram fell to his knees in front of the desk, pulling his son down with him. His face was pale, but his eyes were red-rimmed, a look of suppressed anguish that would likely evoke sympathy from anyone unaware of the situation. The nurse, shocked, didn't dare to look further and quickly closed the door and ran off. Alaric sat in his office chair, not moving an inch, frowning coldly. "Audrey's not here. What's the point of this act?" Bertram looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Dr. Faulkner, I know you hate me, but I absolutely have no intention of competing with you for Audrey. Barnaby and I are strangers in the UK. We just needed a temporary place to stay. We'll move out later, but now you've had us thrown out from Audrey's place. How are we supposed to survive?" Alaric irritably began to retort. "When did I ever?" Before he could finish, the phone on his desk suddenly rang. It was Audrey's grandmother calling. "Alaric, are you busy?" The elderly voice on the phone was warm and affectionate. Alaric Faulkner couldn't help but soften his tone. "Not really, just finished surgery." Mrs. Conroy had watched Alaric grow up since he was a child, treating him like her own grandson. Alaric himself relied on this elder. In his heart, his grandmother and Mrs. Conroy were the people who loved him the most. Hearing the fatigue in Alaric's voice, Mrs. Conroy added a reminder to not overwork yourself before getting to the main point. "Alaric, dear, I've heard about what happened between you and Audrey. Don't worry, I've taken care of that Bertram Cargill fellow. I had my security team throw all his belongings out of Audrey's house and sent him packing. My grandson-in-law can only ever be you, Alaric Faulkner." Listening to the voice in his ear, Alaric was stunned, involuntarily looking at Bertram Cargill kneeling before him. So it was Mrs. Conroy who had him driven away. His heart softened with emotion, but his mouth was filled with bitterness. Alaric held the phone for a long time without speaking. Mrs. Conroy sighed in the silence, her tone surprisingly pleading. "Alaric, dear, I know Audrey has been too much lately, but I still want you to give her another chance. She was just blinded by that man. Once you two are married, she'll settle down. How about if I set your wedding date for next month?" Feeling a lump in his throat, Alaric quickly made up an excuse and hung up the phone. The moment the screen went dark, the office door opened again. Audrey Conroy stormed in, her demeanor fierce. Seeing Bertram Cargill and his son kneeling there, she hurried to help them up. When she turned to look at Alaric, her eyes were cold. "Alaric Faulkner, how old are you? Still playing tattletale? Now you can marry me? Are you satisfied? You're so manipulative. It's disgusting." With those words, she didn't spare him another glance, protecting Bertram Cargill and his son as she slammed the door on her way out. Alaric smiled sardonically, closing his eyes and leaning back in his office chair. Let it be, he thought. He'd be leaving soon anyway. Alaric had assumed he wouldn't see Audrey Conroy or Bertram Cargill again before he left. But that night, young Barnaby Cargill was brought into the A&E by Audrey and Bertram, covered in blood. The three had been in a car accident with Barnaby, the child, sustaining the worst injuries. Bertram was frantic. Seeing Alaric arrive, he grabbed his hand. "Dr. Faulkner, you must save Barnaby." As the on-call doctor, Alaric had no reason to refuse and went straight to the operating theater. A routine minor surgery posed no challenge for Alaric and was quickly completed. However, after the observation period, Barnaby showed no signs of regaining consciousness and remained in a coma. The next day, upon receiving the news, Alaric immediately went to check on the patient. Audrey seemed to have gone out on an errand and wasn't in the room. Only Bertram was there keeping watch. As soon as Bertram saw Alaric enter, he began an emotional accusation with red-rimmed eyes. "Dr. Faulkner, why hasn't Barnaby woken up? Did you do something to him? I know you hate me, but you can't hurt my son." Alaric, unsure of the problem, moved to examine Barnaby's condition. Bertram, however, became agitated, shielding his son and crying out loudly, "Enough! Don't touch my Barnaby. You deliberately botched the surgery to harm him. I want a different doctor. A different doctor." Alaric only wanted to understand Barnaby's specific condition and didn't engage in the argument. He simply pressed the call button nearby. After pressing the button, he looked directly into Bertram's eyes. "You can change doctors if you want, but we must first determine the reason for Barnaby's continued coma. I won't take the blame for a surgical error." When the on-duty nurse arrived, Alaric immediately issued examination orders. "Take a blood sample from the patient right away for testing. We need to check if there's any possibility of pre-surgery self-medication conflicting with the anesthesia." Before Alaric could finish, Bertram suddenly interrupted him angrily. "No, I don't agree. My son didn't take any medication before the surgery, and he wasn't sick. This is clearly your surgical error. Why should you take my son's blood?" As he spoke, he broke down in tears again. Alaric, observing his unnatural behavior, suddenly grasped that thread of inconsistency. Staring at the man in front of him, Alaric Faulkner coldly asked, "Did you conceal Barnaby's medical history?" Bertram Cargill's eyes flickered, and he immediately raised his voice in defense. "What concealed medical history? I'm Barnaby's father. How could I possibly harm him?" Thinking back to a few days ago when Barnaby was pushed down by him, hitting his head and bleeding, Alaric became increasingly convinced of his suspicion. Further discussion was pointless. Once the test results came back, everything would be clear. Alaric directly instructed the nurse, "Draw blood." Bertram gritted his teeth and moved to intervene. "No, you can't. I'm the child's guardian, and I forbid it." Alaric held him back while the young nurse quickly collected the blood sample and rushed out to send it to the lab. As soon as she left, Alaric was about to release Bertram, but he suddenly stepped back and fell to the ground. The next moment, Alaric was shoved away by a strong force. "Bertram!" Audrey Conroy hurried to Bertram's side to help him up. "Are you all right?" When she turned to face Alaric, her eyes were filled with anger. "Alaric Faulkner, this is a hospital and you're a doctor. What are you doing to a patient's family member? Have you lost all sense of professional ethics?" Before Alaric could respond, Bertram quickly grabbed Audrey's sleeve, crying, "Audrey, please save Barnaby. He hasn't woken up after the observation period. This is clearly a surgical error. Will Barnaby never wake up? Dr. Faulkner just had someone draw blood to find the cause. He says he won't take the blame. So does that mean my Barnaby will never wake up?" Alaric was nearly laughing from anger at these words. He tried to explain, "Once the test results come back, we can confirm." "Enough!" Audrey interrupted loudly. She looked at him, disappointment evident in her eyes. "Alaric, I never thought you'd do this intentionally. When did you become so cruel? Harming a child, and then performing surgery on him is endangering a life. You shouldn't be a doctor anymore." Alaric looked at Audrey in disbelief. "What are you trying to do?" Audrey, however, held Bertram tighter and called out towards the door. "Arthur!" Arthur Thornton quickly entered, and Audrey instructed him, "Take him to Riverside Manor to reflect on his actions. Since we're getting married anyway, Help him take a leave of absence from the hospital and handle everything. Reflect on why did she always believe Bertram and assume he was wrong? Seeing Arthur move to grab him, Alaric couldn't contain his anger any longer and shouted, "Don't touch me. I'm not leaving. I'm waiting here for the test results to come back. I did the surgery, and I won't deny." Before he could finish, he felt a sharp pain in his neck, and everything went dark. Alaric was still confined in the manor by Audrey, far from the city center, surrounded by layers of security guards and equipped with signal jammers. Alaric couldn't even use his mobile to call for help. After being held captive for a week, one night the power suddenly went out. Before Alaric could react, his phone rang in the darkness. He quickly answered, and the voice on the other end was urgent. "Mr. Faulkner, you've finally answered. You need to come to the Royal York Hospital immediately. Your grandmother's condition isn't good. If you come now, you might be able to see her one last time." A deafening roar filled his ears, and Alaric felt as if his heart had been struck by a heavy hammer. His hand trembled so much he could barely hold the phone. After hanging up, he put on his coat and ran out. He had to see his grandmother one last time. Rushing downstairs, Alaric was stopped by the security guards at the door. "Mr. Faulkner, Miss Conroy has ordered that you cannot leave." Alaric was frantic, pushing against their hands blocking him, and shouted, "My grandmother is critically ill. Let me out immediately." The guards looked at each other, but ultimately shook their heads. "Mr. Faulkner, please don't make this difficult for us. Miss Conroy gave strict orders. You cannot leave. Why don't you call Miss Conroy? If she says you can go, we won't stop you." With red eyes, Alaric hurriedly took out his phone, almost misdialing Audrey's number in his haste. The first call, no answer. The second call, no answer. The third call rang twice before switching to on another call. Audrey had seen his call but chose to hang up. Alaric's heart plummeted into an abyss, his eyes burning with tears. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his mobile phone. What about his grandmother? He couldn't bear the thought of not seeing her one last time. She was the one who loved him most. Alaric struggled to his feet, ready to dash out the door, but the security guards quickly moved to block him. "Mr. Faulkner, you can't leave. Let me go. I need to see my grandmother. Let me go." Chaos erupted at the entrance of the manor. Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling up outside broke through the commotion. Through tear-filled eyes, Alaric saw Mrs. Conroy's figure. He could no longer hold back, bursting into sobs. "Please, take me to see my grandmother. She's leaving us." On the way, the Conroy family's car pushed the speed limit to its extreme. But by the time they reached Royal York Hospital, 40 minutes had already passed. Alaric anxiously ran into the hospital room, only to see a nurse covering his grandmother's face with a white sheet. He froze in place, laughing in disbelief. "What are you doing? You can't cover her so high. She won't be able to breathe properly while sleeping." Saying this, he slowly walked over and pulled the sheet down. His grandmother's face was revealed, still looking as kind and lovely as ever. But the once warm hands had grown cold, and her body had become stiff. As a doctor, Alaric was intimately familiar with the physiological signs of life. He knew, without a doubt, that his grandmother had passed away. But he didn't want to believe it, couldn't bring himself to accept it. Alaric took his grandmother's hand and pressed it against his cheek, as if trying to warm her body through this gesture. He spoke softly, "Grandmother, Alaric is here. Why won't you open your eyes and look at me?" But only silence filled the room in response, her gentle voice never to be heard again. The young nurse, seeing Alaric like this, couldn't help but try to comfort him. "Your grandmother passed away 30 minutes ago. I know you rushed here as fast as you could, but perhaps this was meant to be." Before she left, the old lady said one thing. She said, "I hope my Alaric will always be happy." After saying this, the nurse left Alaric alone in the room. A moment later, heart-wrenching cries echoed from within. Afterwards, Mrs. Conroy helped Alaric arrange the cremation and other necessary matters. By the time Audrey Conroy learned of this, the funeral had already concluded. She hurried to the funeral site, just in time to see Alaric walking out, dressed in a black suit. His face was pale, seeming to have aged overnight, yet he stood there with a striking beauty, though it was a fragile beauty that looked as if it might shatter at any moment. Audrey felt an inexplicable panic and quickly approached him, explaining, "Alaric, are you all right? I didn't mean to ignore your calls. I didn't know. Barnaby had woken up, and I was with Bertram." Alaric calmly interrupted her. "It's fine. It's all over now." Hearing the words, "it's over," Audrey grew more anxious. She grabbed his arm, forcing a smile as she said, "Alaric, I was wrong this time. Didn't you always want to go hot air ballooning in France? Your birthday is in a few days. Why don't we go and have a proper holiday? What do you say? For now, let's go home." With that, Audrey pulled Alaric into the car without waiting for a response. Back at home, Audrey, still worried, secretly arranged for security to guard the house, fearing Alaric might leave. But Alaric didn't show any unusual behavior. He agreed to go to France with Audrey and spent his time packing. 3 days later, they set off for the airport together. Looking at the 2 suitcases in front of her, Audrey was surprised. "Why did you pack so much?" Alaric's expression remained neutral. "I thought we might stay for a while." Audrey didn't suspect anything and smiled. "All right, as long as you're happy." On the way to the airport, Audrey's phone kept ringing, but she didn't answer a single call. Alaric noticed but said nothing. At the check-in counter, Audrey glanced at her phone and suddenly her expression changed dramatically. "Alaric, something seems to have happened with Barnaby. You go on to France first. I'll join you as soon as I've sorted this out." With that, she turned and left, her steps hurried and without a trace of hesitation. Alaric watched her figure disappear against the flow of people. He pulled out a ticket to York from his bag and softly said, "Goodbye forever, Audrey Conroy." Just before boarding the plane, Alaric received a WhatsApp message from Bertram Cargill. "Angry, aren't you?" "She chose me again." "Angry?" Alaric smirked. It was bearable. Who hasn't loved a few scoundrels in their youth? He promptly deleted Bertram's contact, turned off his phone, and waited for the plane to take off. "Oh, Mr. Conroy, this tender process went incredibly smoothly. All thanks to Chamberlain Limited. Let me raise a toast to you," Aubrey Lyman exclaimed. "You're too kind, Mr. Lyman," Audrey Conroy replied politely. She clinked glasses with her business partner perfunctorily, downed her drink, and fidgeted with her ring, visibly agitated. Her eyes swept over her phone screen. It was already 3:30 in the afternoon. Shouldn't Alaric have arrived at the cabinet by now? Why hadn't he sent her a message to let her know he was safe? Was he still upset? Audrey's mind was in turmoil when suddenly, a ping from her WhatsApp notification broke through her thoughts. She picked up her phone, only to see a message from Bertram Cargill. "Audrey, don't drink too much at these business functions. Take care of yourself." Audrey's lips, which had started to curl into a smile, fell. For once, she didn't reply. Rising from her seat with an excuse to use the ladies, she walked into the corridor. Just as she was about to call Alaric, she ran into a familiar face. "Miss Conroy, are you dining here as well?" the woman asked. Audrey looked up and recognized Dr. Beatrice Weir, Alaric's superior. She nodded politely. "Dr. Weir." Remembering what Alaric had told her the other day, Dr. Weir smiled warmly at Audrey. "I haven't seen you in a while. I haven't had the chance to congratulate you and Alaric on your marriage. You two have been through so much together since childhood. It's wonderful to see you finally tying the knot." Audrey was about to smile and respond when she suddenly caught something amiss. Already married? That couldn't be right. She and Alaric hadn't even had their wedding yet. A sense of unease crept over Audrey as she forced a smile and asked, "Dr. Weir, I think you might be mistaken. Alaric and I aren't married yet." Dr. Weir looked surprised. "That's odd. About 2 weeks ago, Alaric told me he had gotten married and was resigning." As she spoke, a look of realization crossed her face. She laughed. "Oh, I must have misunderstood him. He was probably talking about preparing for your upcoming wedding. But her explanation did little to ease Audrey's growing anxiety. 2 weeks ago, she hadn't agreed to marry Alaric at all. Why did he say he was married? To whom? And why was he resigning? Where was he going? Countless questions bombarded Audrey's mind, making her heart sink. In a panic, she urgently asked, "Dr. Weir, what exactly did Alaric say?" Before she could finish, someone emerged from a nearby private room. "Dr. Weir, what's taking you so long? Everyone's waiting for you." The person pulled Dr. Weir back towards the room as they spoke. Dr. Weir could only give Audrey an apologetic smile before turning away. Left without answers to her burning questions, Audrey stood frozen for a moment, her anxiety mounting. How could she possibly focus on business now? She didn't return to her table. Instead, she strode out of the restaurant. Instructing her assistant to drive her home, Audrey spent the entire journey repeatedly calling Alaric. "The number you have dialed is currently switched off." After dozens of attempts, all met with the same response. Audrey clenched her jaw and sent Alaric a series of WhatsApp messages. "Alaric, haven't you reached the cabinet yet? Why haven't you messaged me? Are you still angry? I can explain about today. Call me back as soon as you see this. I'm really worried about you. Please stop this, all right?" She obsessively refreshed the screen, the entire chat filled with blue ticks, but there was still no reply from him. Upon reaching home, Audrey rushed to Alaric's room. "Alaric's just on holiday. It's just a holiday," she muttered to herself. But as she opened the door and saw the empty room and the wardrobe devoid of even a single piece of clothing, Audrey froze in disbelief. An unacceptable thought crossed her mind. Had he really left? But she quickly shook her head. No, it must be another act. Alaric wouldn't leave her. Gritting her teeth, Audrey turned to her assistant behind her and said, "Find out where Alaric has gone." It was already 4 in the afternoon when Alaric Faulkner's plane landed. The flight was supposed to arrive in York at 2, but due to an unexpected downpour, it had been delayed by 2 hours. It was still raining when he exited the airport. Edinburgh's climate was usually pleasant, and he wasn't used to such strong winds. Alaric had only worn a light trench coat today, and the wind and rain had nearly soaked him through. "Phew, it's freezing," he muttered. He blew on his hands to warm them up and was about to pull out his phone when a warm coat was suddenly draped over him. "Why didn't you dress more warmly?" a voice asked. The cold around him seemed to dissipate in an instant. Alaric Faulkner looked up, his eyes meeting a delicate bouquet of red roses, with a black umbrella overhead. Agatha Cornwell smiled as she handed him the roses. "I've never dated a man before, but my mates all suggested I bring flowers. Do you like them? Is it too strange?" The slight dampness in the air, mixed with the fresh scent of roses, filled his nostrils. The woman before him was as clean and pure as everything around them. Something soft in his heart was inexplicably touched. Alaric chuckled. It was indeed a bit odd, but he didn't dislike it. Shaking his head, he hugged the bouquet closer. "I love them." Agatha's lips curved into a smile as she naturally took Alaric's suitcase and linked her arm with his, leading him forward. "Shall we get in the car? The heater's on, so it won't be so cold." Once in the car, the warm air made Alaric realize how numb his cheeks had become from the cold. After a moment, he turned to Agatha and said, "Thank you for coming to pick me up." Before boarding the plane, Alaric had sent Agatha a message, telling her he would be arriving in York today. After all, they had originally planned for her to pick him up in Edinburgh in a month's time. He felt he should let her know about his early arrival in York to avoid any confusion later. To his surprise, just minutes after sending the message, Agatha called him. She asked for details about his flight's arrival time and said she would come to pick him up. Feeling guilty for troubling Agatha and making her wait so long, Alaric apologized. "The flight was delayed today. You must have waited a long time. I'm sorry for wasting your time." Agatha smiled, unconcerned. "Waiting for my husband isn't a waste of time. I was sitting in the car, so I wasn't cold." She wore a black turtleneck sweater that accentuated her impressive figure. Her left hand rested on the steering wheel, long fingers tapping lazily. As she glanced over, her eyes held a unique tenderness. Alaric froze for a moment, quickly averting his gaze, his Adam's apple bobbing twice. What was this about being her husband? Even if they were legally married, she seemed far too comfortable saying it. Agatha admired his expression but didn't tease him further. She started the car. "You must be hungry. I'll take you to eat first, then we'll head home." Not knowing what Alaric preferred, Agatha chose a private restaurant that served cuisine similar to Edinburgh's flavors. After ordering, they sat across from each other in silence. Alaric felt oddly awkward. He fidgeted with the hem of his shirt and stood up. "I'm going to the loo." Agatha smiled at him. "All right, I'll wait for you." Her smile made Alaric feel strange all over. He walked out of the private room almost robotically, forgetting to take his phone. Agatha watched Alaric leave. Just then, his phone on the table began to ring. Someone was calling Alaric. Agatha hadn't intended to answer, but the phone kept ringing. The caller seemed very urgent, calling back within seconds of being disconnected. Worried it might be an emergency, Agatha decided to answer the call. "Hello." There was no response from the other end. Agatha frowned and said hello again. This time, there was finally a sound, but the caller's voice was full of anger. "Who are you? Where's Alaric Faulkner? Why are you answering his phone?" The woman's accusatory tone irritated Agatha. Her eyes narrowed as she coldly replied, "I'm his wife. Who are you?" As she finished speaking, she caught sight of Alaric at the doorway of the private room. She held out the phone to him. The phone kept ringing. "I was worried it might be urgent, so I answered for you." Seeing the contact name on the phone, Alaric looked up in surprise, meeting Agatha's gaze. He seemed to want to say something but hesitated. Many things seemed difficult to explain in just a few words, but as his wife, Agatha had the right to know these things. How should he begin? Agatha, however, understood his concerns. She placed the phone in Alaric's hand, looking at him. "We can talk later. Answer the call first. If you don't want to take it here, I can step out." With that, Agatha started to leave, but Alaric grabbed her hand. Facing her surprised look, he pressed his lips together. "There's nothing you can't hear." Then, Alaric put the phone on speaker. Audrey Conroy's loud voice came through clearly. Alaric took a deep breath and said, "What do you need?" "Alaric." Audrey Conroy's voice held a hint of delight, but quickly turned somber. "Where have you been? Why did it take you so long to answer? And who was that man who picked up earlier? I've sent you so many messages and you didn't reply to any of them. What game are you playing now?" Her questioning escalated into a shout by the end. Even through the phone, Alaric Faulkner could imagine Audrey's impatient expression. She must be annoyed that he had wasted her precious time and disturbed her busy schedule again. A faint trace of mockery flitted across his mind, too slight to stir any emotional waves. Alaric spoke calmly. "Audrey, I'm married. The person who answered the phone earlier was my wife." Audrey didn't believe a word of it, thinking he was just acting out. She softened her tone and explained, "Alaric, stop this nonsense. I know you're upset about me leaving you today, but there's really nothing between Bertram and me. I'm just grateful to him for saving my life. That's all. You're my future husband. Don't you have even this much tolerance?" "I'm not joking," Alaric said gravely. "Audrey, I'm on my honeymoon with my wife. Please don't call again." Audrey's patience wore thin, and she raised her voice once more. "Alaric Faulkner, is this the only trick you know? Playing hard to get?" Just then, Arthur Thornton's voice came through from Audrey's end. "Ms. Conroy, we've found Mr. Faulkner's flight information." Amidst the sound of rustling papers, Audrey seemed to calm down. "So you're in York now? Wait there. I'm coming to talk to you face to face." Seemingly convinced that Alaric was just seeking her attention, she resumed her lecturing tone. "Alaric, I get tired of these games too, you know? And using marriage as an excuse to resign with Dr. Weir is really childish. Do you think I'd believe you married someone else? You're an orphan. Who else would marry you besides me? She suddenly stopped, apparently realizing she had gone too far, and hurriedly tried to backtrack. Alaric, I didn't mean it like that. I just got carried away. But Alaric didn't want to hear any more. He hung up abruptly and blocked all her contact methods. His heart was pounding fiercely. He lowered his gaze to steady his breathing, his hand on his knee slowly clenching into a fist. After 6 years, he had finally heard Audrey's true thoughts. Just because he was an orphan with no family to rely on, she thought it was perfectly fine to mistreat him and drag out their engagement. All those past excuses about having her reasons turned out to be deliberate lies. She was so sure he wouldn't leave, that no one else would marry him except her. How disgusting. How could the once beautiful person in his memory have become so utterly rotten? His body began to shake, his stomach churning. Alaric's vision blurred, and he nearly fell off the chair. But the expected pain didn't come. Someone steadied his shoulders, holding him firmly in place. Are you all right? Should we go to the hospital? Agatha Cornwell's voice was full of concern. Alaric leaned against her, and though he couldn't see her face, he knew she must be wearing a worried expression. His new wife was different from Audrey. The angry disgust in his heart gradually subsided. Alaric slowly stood up and shook his head at Agatha. I'm fine, probably just a bit of low blood sugar earlier. He hesitated, then said, the person who called me just now was actually my ex-fiancée. She doesn't know about our marriage. After briefly explaining everything, Alaric looked at Agatha, waiting for her response. In truth, they had both married due to family pressure as a temporary measure. If she now felt he had deceived her and wanted a divorce, it would be understandable. Agatha did indeed become serious, staring into his eyes for a long moment. Alaric's heart clenched tightly, but then he heard her ask, do you still have feelings for her? To her surprise, Agatha didn't scold or get angry. Instead, she asked such a question. Alaric was a bit confused. After a moment's hesitation, he shook his head. It's over between us. But if you mind, why should I mind? Agatha raised an eyebrow, the smile on her lips slightly mischievous. It would be strange if a man as excellent as you didn't have an ex. Besides, you two are over now. I'm your wife, and even if she wanted to compete with me fairly, she couldn't win. As if influenced by Agatha's casual tone, Alaric followed up dazedly, why? Because I won't give her a chance to steal you away. Agatha leaned in closer, chuckling softly. And we're in a military marriage. Breaking up a military marriage can get you arrested. Alaric felt his face heat up inexplicably under Agatha's gaze, and he instinctively turned his head away. But her attitude had reassured Alaric, and his tense shoulders relaxed. Remembering the phone call earlier, Alaric hesitated for a moment before saying to Agatha, if you can, I'd like to ask you to hide my whereabouts. I don't want her to find me and disturb our life. The words our life seemed to please Agatha, and her tone became even gentler. All right, if you don't want her to disturb you, I won't let her disturb you. As she spoke, she handed him another cup of hot water. Was your stomach uncomfortable earlier? Drink some hot water to soothe it. I'll go and check on our food. You'll feel better once you've eaten. The warm steam rose from the glass, blurring his vision slightly. Alaric watched Agatha's back as she talked to the waiter, and inexplicably felt a lump in his throat. By now, Agatha had returned to her seat. Seeing Alaric still lowering his head, she cleared her throat and said, do you have any requests for the wedding? Alaric kept his eyes down and didn't speak, just shaking his head. The only person he had hoped would attend his wedding was gone. What did it matter what the wedding was like now? It didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered. Sensing Alaric's low spirits, Agatha leaned closer to him, her tone somewhat apologetic. The timing is a bit rushed. If we hold the wedding in the military base, it will inevitably be a bit simple. I'm sorry about that, but we should still invite the people we need to invite. I remember you told me that you agreed to marry me because of your grandmother. This time, we must invite her to witness our wedding. These words struck Alaric's heart directly. He hadn't expected Agatha to remember what he had said. So, in this world, besides him, there was someone else who remembered his grandmother. Tears fell instantly, and he looked at Agatha, crying like a child. But Grandma can't come anymore. They all stopped me. I was too late. I didn't get to see her one last time. I didn't even get to show her our marriage certificate. His emotions were so intense that Agatha quickly pulled him into her arms to comfort him. Through Alaric's broken narrative, Agatha pieced together the truth of everything. Learning that Audrey had actually imprisoned Alaric, preventing him from seeing his grandmother one last time, Agatha's lips tightened, her eyes narrowed slightly, and she felt a surge of anger. While softly comforting Alaric, she sent out a message on her phone. The sound of a bottle being thrown aside echoed. Audrey sat on the floor, her face flushed. She tilted her head back, swallowing the burning liquid in her glass, and roughly ran her fingers through her hair, her eyes filled with pain. It had been 3 days since Alaric left, and she still hadn't found any trace of him. Although Arthur had managed to find Alaric's flight information, he hadn't checked into any hotel afterwards. York was such a large city. How could one easily find a single person? At first, Audrey was certain that Alaric was just throwing a tantrum, that he couldn't possibly leave her. But after these few days, the idea in her heart had begun to waver. "Alaric, where on earth have you gone?" she mumbled, her eyes red. As she reached for another bottle, there was a noise at the front door, followed by Bertram's voice. "Audrey, why have you drunk so much?" Bertram Cargill approached Audrey Conroy, taking the bottle of wine from her hand and looking at her with concern. "Audrey, I know you're upset about Dr. Faulkner, but seeing you like this is breaking my heart. I understand your feelings for him run deep, and I shouldn't say anything, but I can't help it. If you're going to love someone, it should be someone who loves you back. Someone who truly loves you wouldn't let you hurt yourself like this." Bertram gazed at Audrey with tender eyes. Without mentioning Alaric Faulkner by name, every word he spoke subtly criticized him. He wanted to express that he was the one who loved Audrey the most, that only he truly cared for her. Audrey, either drunk or agreeing with his words, kept her eyes lowered and remained silent. Bertram's heart leapt with hope, and he leaned closer to her. "Come on, Audrey, the floor's cold. Let me help you up." He had dressed carefully today, his bespoke suit accentuating his broad shoulders and narrow waist. As he bent down, a faint woody cologne wafted from him, utterly alluring. But just as he gripped Audrey's arm, she suddenly lashed out, shoving him away. "Don't touch me." Bertram fell to the ground, scraping his elbow. He looked at her in disbelief. Audrey, no longer showing her previous affection for him, didn't even try to help him up. She just frowned impatiently. "I'll find you a new flat. You need to move out of here as soon as possible, and don't come back." Alaric had never liked Bertram moving in. If she kicked him out, maybe Alaric would come back. Bertram could hardly believe his ears. Audrey was telling him to move out? Why? This was completely different from what he had imagined. He had managed to drive Alaric away. There should be no more obstacles between him and Audrey. He should be happier now. Why had everything changed instead? Bertram clenched his fists, his heart surging with discontent. He wanted to say more to Audrey, but Audrey didn't want to listen anymore. She held her head, swaying as she prepared to return to her room. At that moment, her phone suddenly rang in her pocket. It was Arthur Thornton calling. "Ms. Conroy, we've found Mr. Faulkner's whereabouts." All the alcohol-induced haze cleared from Audrey's mind as she quickly asked, "Where is he?" Since that day, Alaric Faulkner had been staying at the community center with Agatha Cornwell. With their wedding approaching, there was a lot to prepare, and the couple had been busy shopping for the past few days. "Shall we look at some home textiles next?" Alaric sat in the passenger seat, pulling out a long list and sighing. Until they started preparing, they hadn't realized how overwhelming it could be. Who knew getting married could be such a complicated affair? Alaric had no living relatives, and Agatha had lost her parents early, with only a grandfather in Westminster. Without elders to help with the preparations, they had to arrange everything themselves. They had been looking at this list for 3 days and hadn't even confirmed half of the items. Agatha, driving the car, glanced at the worried Alaric with a smile. Tired? I could handle the preparations alone, you know. You could go home and rest. Alaric had become quite comfortable with Agatha over the past couple of days and was no longer so reserved. He joked with her, which was rare. I don't trust your straight girl aesthetics. I don't want to end up living in a room plastered with floral light switch covers. Hearing Alaric tease her, Agatha didn't get angry. She raised an eyebrow and said, "You just don't understand. This is the inherent simplicity ingrained in the British soul." Alaric chuckled, looking out the window, his mood softening. After confirming the home textile styles at the store, Alaric was ready to look at furniture next. But just as they left the textile shop, Agatha suddenly grabbed his hand and walked into a coffee shop. "Wait here for me. I'll be back in a moment." With these words, she hurriedly left. "Hey, Agatha!" Alaric called out, but couldn't stop her. Confused, he ordered a drink and sat by the window, obediently waiting. Not long after, footsteps sounded behind him. "Back so soon?" Alaric turned around in surprise, but the smile on his lips froze instantly when he saw who was standing there. The newcomer was none other than Audrey Conroy. She stood before Alaric Faulkner, her eyes red and puffy, her hair disheveled. Her bespoke suit dress was wrinkled, and she looked utterly exhausted, a far cry from her usual polished appearance. Audrey paid no heed to the curious glances from others. Her eyes, filled with excitement, were fixed on Alaric. She stepped forward, reaching out to him. "Alaric, I've finally found you. Let's go home." To her surprise, Alaric took a step back, avoiding her hand. His voice was cold as he asked, "Why are you here?" Those simple words left Audrey feeling as if she'd been plunged into icy water. She stood frozen, unable to move. She never imagined that after searching for Alaric for so many days, she'd receive such a cold response. Instinctively, she thought he might be playing hard to get, but looking at his expression, Audrey realized with a shock that this wasn't an act. He genuinely seemed unhappy to see her. Audrey's heart began to race. She forced an awkward smile and spoke softly, trying to coax him. "Alaric, darling, let's go home, shall we? I've already asked Bertram to move out. I won't let him bother you anymore." Alaric frowned as he looked at Audrey, not understanding what she was playing at. When he had been by her side, she had always treated him with disdain and even hurt him for the sake of another woman. Now that he had finally given up, she was here begging him to come back? Wasn't that ridiculous? Noticing the curious glances from other customers, Alaric, not wanting to become the subject of gossip, gestured to the seat opposite him. "Sit down. Let's talk." Hearing this, Audrey felt slightly relieved. She walked to the seat and sat down. She believed she had identified the source of his anger. It all came down to Bertram Cargill. All she needed to do was resolve that issue. Audrey composed herself and quickly assured him, "Alaric, don't worry. I'll handle the Bertram situation from now on. I won't make you angry again. If you find him bothersome, I'll send him back to Westminster. You'll never have to see him again." Alaric looked into her eyes and calmly stated the truth. "Audrey, this has nothing to do with him. We're over." Upon hearing this, Audrey immediately rejected the idea, raising her voice. "Who says we're over? Alaric Faulkner, we're still engaged. We're fiancés." As she spoke, Audrey became more and more certain. With tears in her eyes, she reached for his hand. "Alaric, just come home with me. I won't make you angry anymore. Grandmother has already set our wedding date. You always listen to her, don't you?" Alaric pulled his hand away and looked at her, speaking slowly. "I'm afraid we can't get married." What do you mean?" Audrey's lips trembled as she watched Alaric open his phone and show her a Facebook post. 2 small books were placed side by side, their striking red covers reflecting in her eyes like daggers piercing her vision, drawing blood. "I told you, I'm already married." Audrey froze as if under a spell. When she finally reacted, she quickly grabbed the phone and looked at it, frantically saying, This can't be. Alaric, you've edited this photo, haven't you? This isn't funny. Really. She desperately tried to deny that the photo was real, but the official stamps, dates, and certifying authority were all too authentic. And the photo of Alaric smiling with that woman couldn't be fake. Had he really married someone else? Audrey Conroy sat rigidly in her seat, but suddenly sprang into action. With reddened eyes and a surge of anger, she shockingly threw Alaric Faulkner's phone to the ground. With a loud crash, the phone shattered into pieces. Alaric looked at her frenzied state, his clear eyes now tinged with anger. Audrey, have you gone mad? Audrey, beyond reason now, hastily grabbed Alaric's hand and began pulling him towards the door. I won't accept this, Alaric. You can't marry someone else. You must divorce her. You want to get married, right? Let's get married right now. You're my fiancé. You can't marry anyone else. What nonsense are you spouting? Let go of me. Alaric struggled, but Audrey seemed to have lost all sense of reason. She quickly dragged him out of the cafe. Let go of me. Audrey, I'm not going anywhere. Alaric desperately pushed against Audrey's arms, but she paid no heed. Security guards rushed in from outside, helping to drag him out. As he was being pulled and yanked, Alaric suddenly twisted his ankle. A sharp pain shot through him, and Alaric nearly fell, but Audrey continued to drag him forward relentlessly. Passers-by stopped to watch, gossiping amongst themselves, but none dared to intervene. Just as Alaric was about to shout for help, he was suddenly yanked away. The next moment, a cold voice rang out. Who gave you permission to touch him? Alaric looked up to see Agatha Cornwell's tense profile. He was about to speak when a twinge of pain from his ankle made him wince. Agatha looked at him worriedly. What's wrong? Did you twist your ankle? She quickly helped Alaric sit down on a nearby bench, then took out a plaster from her pocket and placed it on the back of his hand. The small wound that had been stinging all day was now covered, leaving Alaric momentarily stunned. He had accidentally cut himself this morning, and he was surprised that Agatha had noticed such a small detail. Looking at the cute plaster on the back of his hand, he felt as if his throat was stuffed with cotton. Just now. Did you go to buy plasters for me? Agatha looked at his swollen ankle with concern, casually replying, You've been wincing in pain several times today, so I thought putting a plaster on might help. I didn't expect that while I was out, you'd be accosted by someone so inconsiderate. Then, she turned to Audrey with a hostile gaze, coldly rebuking. His ankle is twisted, didn't you see? You wanted him to go with you? Is this how you show your care for him? Audrey looked at Agatha, immediately recognizing her as the woman from the marriage certificate photo. Her eyes instantly turned cold. She felt guilty for hurting Alaric, but still stubbornly insisted. Alaric is my fiancé. Our affairs are none of your business, outsider. Fiancé? Agatha's lips curled into a cold smile as she firmly wrapped her arm around Alaric's shoulders. Too bad. He's my husband now. Agatha Cornwell's husband. With people still watching, Alaric felt a bit embarrassed and coughed lightly, saying, All right, that's enough. Agatha gripped his hand tightly, snorting, What are you afraid of? We're a legally married couple. I'm not some mistress. Seeing the intimacy between the two, Audrey's anger burned like fire in her heart. Agatha's implication that she was the other woman struck a particularly painful chord. Audrey could no longer contain herself. Shouting, Let go! She ordered her 2 bodyguards to lunge at Agatha. Agatha was not intimidated at all. With a cold face, she stepped forward, easily taking on both opponents at once. Years of training in the gym had honed Agatha's combat skills, and she effortlessly took down the 2 amateur bodyguards. Audrey, furious, joined the fray herself, but unexpectedly, Agatha didn't dodge this time. The slap landed squarely on her face, grazing Agatha's lip. Seeing Agatha injured, Alaric immediately pulled her close, cradling her face. Are you all right? Does it hurt? Agatha seemed to want to smile reassuringly. The movement pulled at her wound, making her wince in pain. Seeing Agatha like this, Alaric could no longer contain his anger. He angrily pushed Audrey away. Why do you resort to violence at the slightest provocation? Are you mad? Audrey Conroy stumbled as she was pushed, her high heel twisting painfully. Despite her discomfort, Alaric Faulkner didn't spare her a glance, focusing entirely on Agatha Cornwell. Stung by Alaric's harsh words and unable to defend herself, Audrey felt utterly miserable. Her wrist still ached from Agatha's grip, yet she couldn't voice her pain. With Agatha's combat skills, she could have easily dodged that punch. Instead, she took it deliberately. She was playing the victim. As if confirming Audrey's thoughts, Agatha, standing behind Alaric, flashed her a smug, challenging smile. Furious, Audrey struggled to her feet. Alaric, she's faking it. She's just trying to win your sympathy. Seeing Audrey approach, Alaric quickly shielded Agatha. If you try anything, I'll call the police. Watching him protect another woman so fiercely, Audrey felt as if her heart had been stabbed. Her hands trembling, she let out a bitter laugh. Alaric, are you abandoning me for her? We're both from prominent families. What is she compared to us? What can she offer you? Audrey reached for Alaric's hand, but he shook her off without hesitation. You're busy managing multi-million-pound contracts, while my wife serves our country. Yet she still finds time for me, devoted to our relationship. That's what she gives me, and that's the difference between you two. Alaric's gaze was cold, as if looking at a stranger. It's over, Audrey. Let's not meet again. With that, Alaric took Agatha's hand and left. Audrey moved to follow them. Alaric, wait! Just then, her phone buzzed. It was her assistant, Arthur Thornton. Ms. Conroy, please come back immediately. There's an emergency at the company. Audrey paused, frowning. What's happened? Meanwhile, Agatha had helped Alaric into the car. Seated in the back, he watched in surprise as Agatha retrieved a small medical kit from the boot. As she prepared to apply ointment, Alaric felt oddly embarrassed and tried to stop her. I can do it myself. Agatha pulled back, raising an eyebrow. It's quite swollen. The bruise needs to be massaged out and you don't have the strength for it. You're a doctor. Surely you know that. Alaric bit his lip. Of course he knew, but having her massage his ankle. Suddenly, Agatha leaned in close, her voice low. Or are you just shy? Her striking beauty up close was overwhelming, her teasing tone enticing. Alaric quickly looked down, trying to save face. Who's shy? Not me. Agatha grinned triumphantly, having gotten the response she wanted. All right then, if you're not shy, let's get started. She rubbed the ointment between her palms and grasped his ankle. Hey! Ah! Before Alaric could react, the pain brought tears to his eyes. Seeing his discomfort, Agatha gentled her touch. Bear with it. Once it's massaged out, you'll suffer less in the coming days. As the pain subsided, Alaric found himself staring at the top of Agatha's head, then at the plaster on her hand. His throat suddenly felt very dry. Almost involuntarily, he voiced the question that had been troubling him for days. Why are you so kind to me? Alaric Faulkner asked. Agatha Cornwell didn't even look up, as if she thought the question wasn't even worth asking. Since we're married now, I should get to know you better. I've carefully looked at your Facebook profile and learned that you like grapes and strawberries, dislike bananas, prefer white, hate yellow, and your birthday is on the 22nd of July. Her head was lowered, and her magnetic voice came from below, a bit muffled, but each word struck Alaric's heart. He hadn't expected Agatha to know so much about his likes and dislikes, and each detail was so accurate. While he was still in a daze, Agatha looked up at Alaric and smiled. Well, am I right? Alaric's heart melted, and he replied in a hoarse voice, yes. It turns out that to truly understand someone, all you need is a caring heart, regardless of how long you've known them. 20 days isn't short, 20 years isn't long. Those who care need no teaching, those who don't, can't be taught. Agatha was genuinely trying to be good to him. Initially, he thought they were just a couple brought together by convenient circumstances, that being cordial would be enough. and they might even end up divorcing. But now, Agatha was making an effort to strengthen their relationship. As Alaric watched Agatha's serious movements, he suddenly remembered his grandmother's words. "Alaric, what kind of person do you think you should marry to be happy?" I suppose there are only two types of women, either the one I love or the one who loves me. No, you should choose someone who is inherently good. Love can fade, but only by being with someone responsible and patient can you find happiness." At that time, Alaric didn't understand what his grandmother meant. Now he felt he might finally get it. Agatha finally felt satisfied with her massage and released Alaric's ankle. Although it hasn't reduced the swelling yet, it shouldn't hurt as much in the next couple of days. Alaric looked at his reddened ankle, feeling as if Agatha's body heat was still lingering on it, and he felt oddly thirsty. Glancing at the small first aid kit nearby, he changed the subject. "Why do you have a first aid kit in your car?" Agatha closed the kit's lid. "Sometimes I get injured during missions, and being able to treat myself quickly can be life-saving." She spoke casually, but Alaric sensed the danger implied and became anxious. "Are all your missions so dangerous?" Hearing this, Agatha leaned in, placing her hand next to Alaric, encircling him, and chuckled softly. "Is my husband worried about me?" Her features were strikingly beautiful, but her eyes were particularly captivating. When she looked at someone with her full attention, they seemed to hold a galaxy of stars, making it hard to resist. She always teased him like this. Was she certain he wouldn't do anything to her? With nowhere to hide, Alaric felt a surge of desire to conquer, and he actually leaned in closer. "Didn't you say we should get to know each other better?" His words were cut short as Alaric's eyes widened, feeling a brief wetness on his lips. Agatha licked her lips, her eyes full of predatory aggression. "Incredibly sexy." "I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself." Alaric covered his mouth, his eyes wide, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down as he leaned back against the car seat, his heart pounding. Agatha had actually kissed him? What was wrong with this woman? How could she kiss someone so suddenly? The atmosphere in the car suddenly became intimate. Alaric Faulkner just stared at Agatha Cornwell without saying a word. Agatha didn't move either, lazily curling her lips into a smile, looking like a cat who had just stolen some cream. In the silence, it was Agatha's phone ringing that broke the quiet. She answered the call and stepped out of the car. Alaric watched Agatha and noticed that after listening to the call for a while, her expression became serious. "All right, I understand." Agatha hung up the phone, returned to Alaric's side, and helped him into the passenger seat. Sitting in the driver's seat, Agatha looked at him apologetically and said, "I'm sorry, but the wedding might have to be postponed. I'll take you home first." Alaric looked at her and asked anxiously, "Is there a mission?" Agatha started the car. "Yes, there's some unrest in Chester. I need to investigate secretly. You should wait for me in York." As soon as she finished speaking, Alaric gripped her hand tightly. Under Agatha's surprised gaze, he said softly and slowly, "This time, take me with you. I'll be your medical kit." Meanwhile, Audrey Conroy was in a state of distress. When she flew back to Edinburgh, it was already 6 in the evening. After traveling back and forth on 2 flights in one day, Audrey was exhausted, but she had no time to rest and went straight to the company to check on the situation. Although Arthur Thornton had briefly described what had happened over the phone, when Audrey finally understood the situation, she found it was far worse than she had imagined. The company's main project had hit a roadblock. Partners who heard the news wanted to terminate contracts, and even the bank, which had always been friendly, had changed its attitude and wanted to recall the loan they had negotiated. Before she could appease these people, the company's shareholders also got wind of the news. They were worried that their dividends would be affected and demanded that Audrey give them an explanation. Audrey could only hold an emergency board meeting overnight to reassure these shareholders and ask for some time to resolve this crisis. After 2 busy days, the company's affairs were largely stabilized. Audrey finally had time to spare, and just as she was about to go find Alaric Faulkner again, Bertram Cargill called her. Because of Alaric's departure, Audrey was actually a bit resentful towards Bertram. But remembering his life-saving grace, she couldn't bring herself to be too harsh. After hesitating for a moment, Audrey still answered the call. On the other end of the phone, Bertram's voice was very excited. "Audrey, Barnaby is awake. He's been asking to see you. Can you come and visit him?" Barnaby had been injured because of her, and Audrey felt a bit guilty, so she agreed to see him. When she arrived at the hospital room, Bertram saw her coming, put down the apple in his hand, and came to greet her. "Audrey, you're here." Audrey responded with a nod, but frowned when she saw Barnaby still sleeping. "Didn't you say Barnaby wanted to see me? He's asleep, isn't he?" Seeing her impatient expression, Bertram felt disheartened but forced a smile and said, "I wouldn't lie to you. Barnaby was awake earlier, but he's fallen asleep again now. You look like you've lost weight recently. Are you still upset about Dr. Faulkner?" Biting his lip, Bertram looked at Audrey with concern and advised, "Audrey, why don't you stop looking for Dr. Faulkner? It pains me to see you torturing yourself like this." He put on the same expression as before, which usually made Audrey look back at him lovingly. But this tried and tested method seemed to have lost its effect now. Audrey looked at Bertram with irritation in her eyes. "My relationship with Alaric is none of your business. Since Barnaby isn't awake, I have things to do at the company, so I'll be leaving now." With that, she turned to leave. Having finally met face to face, Bertram certainly didn't want to let her go. He gritted his teeth and quickly grabbed Audrey's arm, pleading, "Audrey, can you please watch Barnaby for a while? There's no hot water left in the thermos. I'm gonna get some more. Someone needs to stay in the room, and the nurse will be coming to change the floor soon." Audrey didn't want to stay longer, but she couldn't leave a child unattended, so she nodded in agreement. After Bertram left with the thermos, it wasn't long before the nurse came to change the floor. Audrey looked at Barnaby and suddenly remembered the previous incident, so she asked the nurse a question. "Last time when your Dr. Faulkner made a surgical error, did this child have any lasting effects?" Audrey's question seemed perfectly reasonable, but it unexpectedly ignited the young nurse's temper. She slammed the supplies onto the tray and glared at Audrey, saying, "Who told you this child's coma was due to Dr. Faulkner's surgical error? He's in a coma because his family concealed his medical history before the surgery. They didn't disclose that he was a congenital heart disease patient. Of course, he wouldn't wake up if too much anesthesia was used." Hearing this, Audrey felt her blood run cold. She mumbled, "It wasn't a surgical error? How is that possible?" The young nurse, holding the tray, rolled her eyes dramatically at Audrey. "Why wouldn't it be possible? Dr. Faulkner noticed something was wrong that day and had me personally take blood samples. I saw the report with my own eyes. Later, Dr. Faulkner resigned. I didn't even have a chance to give him this report. This poor child, stuck with such a careless mother. What rotten luck." With that, the nurse finished tidying the tray and stormed out of the room. Audrey stood by the bed, recalling everything that had happened. Her vision blurred and she nearly collapsed. What had she done to Alaric? That day, Alaric had tried to explain everything, but she had believed he was making excuses. He said he wanted to wait for that report, but she had Arthur knock him unconscious and lock him up in Riverside Manor. Later, because she didn't answer his calls, he missed saying goodbye to his grandmother for the last time. Every time he needed her, what had she been doing? It seemed she had always been held back by Bertram. At this moment, the overwhelming regret in Audrey's heart found an outlet. She knew she had made a mistake, but she also wanted to find a scapegoat to ease her conscience a little. It was all Bertram's fault. It was he who had manipulated her, blinding her and causing her to hurt Alaric. Just then, the door clicked open, and Bertram walked in. Seeing that Audrey was still there, he smiled. "Audrey, you." Before he could finish his sentence, Bertram was pushed to the ground. The thermos fell, crashing to the floor with the inner container shattering into pieces. His palm cut by the shards, Bertram looked up in confusion, only to be met with another slap across his face. Through the stinging pain, he heard Audrey demand, Bertram Cargill, how dare you? You've been scheming right under my nose. You deliberately framed Alaric just to drive him away. Besides concealing the medical history, what else have you done? Looking up, he saw Audrey's eyes were frighteningly red, her chest heaving violently. Bertram felt a surge of panic, completely baffled as to how this had been exposed. Covering his face, he still tried to maintain his facade, crying, "Audrey, I didn't do anything. I genuinely forgot about Barnaby's heart condition at the time. It wasn't intentional." As he spoke, he lunged forward and grabbed Audrey's legs, intending to continue his tearful plea. But Audrey kicked him away in disgust, shouting, "Get off me!" Bertram was knocked back, colliding with a nearby trolley. The items on it clattered to the floor. The commotion finally woke Barnaby on the bed. Seeing his father being hit, he began to cry in fear. "Auntie Audrey, please don't hit Dad. My head hurts so much." As Audrey looked at Barnaby now, all her previous affection had vanished. She found his crying irritating. But as her gaze swept over the bandage on the child's head, in a flash of insight, she recalled some details. She remembered that when they brought Barnaby to the hospital, Bertram had deliberately asked her some questions, and seemed to have taken photos or perhaps even a video. Had those words also been intentionally passed on to Alaric by Bertram? Those words were so hurtful, Audrey Conroy shuddered at the memory. Alaric probably didn't know. Did he? Growing increasingly anxious, her gaze swept over the mobile phone beside her. She snatched it up and commanded Bertram Cargill, "Unlock it." Bertram's face was streaked with tears. Even at this moment, he clung to false hope, sobbing as he tried to defend himself. "Audrey, there's nothing on my phone. I swear I didn't say anything to Dr. Faulkner." Audrey had no patience for his excuses. She lit up the phone screen and, gripping his chin, forcibly used facial recognition to unlock the device. She quickly opened WhatsApp but couldn't find Alaric Faulkner in the contacts list. Just as Audrey was about to breathe a sigh of relief, she was inexplicably compelled to open Bertram's Facebook profile. Scrolling down, she saw a post she hadn't seen before. It was a photo of her sitting by the hospital bed that day. Clicking on the live photos, she heard her own mocking voice. "He's just an orphan. Where else could he go? At most, he's just gone to perform surgery elsewhere. I've seen this trick many times." This post was set to be visible only to select friends, which is why Audrey had never seen it before. And now, the identity of that friend was unmistakable. How heartbroken must Alaric have been when he heard those words? Filled with regret and fury, Audrey smashed the phone into Bertram's face, shouting, "You bastard!" The impact left a large gash on Bertram's forehead, causing him to see stars from the pain. But he couldn't afford to dwell on the pain. He still lunged forward, clutching at Audrey's trouser leg, pleading, "Audrey, you can't do this to me. I'm the one who saved your life." "Saved my life?" Audrey scoffed, kicking him away again. "It's because of that ridiculous life-saving debt that I let you into my life," hurting Alaric in the process. The stiletto heel struck Bertram squarely in the chest, leaving him trembling in pain. Seeing Audrey about to leave, he cried out desperately, "Audrey, I truly love you. Why does it have to be Alaric Faulkner? I can be just as good." Audrey paused, her gaze sweeping over his face with disgust. You? You dare to compare yourself to my Alaric? Don't talk about loving me. All you love is my money. If you ever dare to show your face to me again, I'll end you." With that, Audrey strode out of the hospital room. Bertram lay on the floor, watching her retreating figure, his heart filled with despair. Only one thought echoed in his mind. It was over. Back in the UK, he had been living in a council estate, barely scraping by. It was only because he saved Audrey's life that he had finally tasted the good life. Now, to go back to that, how could he accept it? But no matter how unwilling he was, it made no difference. Soon, Bertram was notified by the hospital staff that no one had renewed the payment for Barnaby's room, and they needed to be discharged immediately. Bertram hurried to the inpatient department to renew the payment. When he tried to swipe the card, he discovered that Audrey had frozen all the cards she had given him. "Audrey, you can't be this cruel, can you?" Bertram panicked and quickly dialed Audrey's number, only to find it unreachable. He then tried to send her a WhatsApp message, only to discover that Audrey had blocked him. Without money, Bertram had no choice but to take Barnaby home. When they arrived, he found Arthur Thornton leading workers in moving his belongings out of the manor. He rushed forward to stop them. "No, you can't move my things." Arthur Thornton stood to the side, pushing up his glasses and coldly warning, "Mr. Cargill, you should stop making a fuss. The house was lent to you temporarily by Miss Conroy, and now she wants it back. You can't possibly stay here any longer. None of your belongings will be missing. It's best you leave quietly." The workers quickly emptied the house and drove Bertram Cargill and his son out of the community. Bertram, still unwilling to give up, tried to go back in, but the security guards were not to be trifled with. They came out with their batons, ready to drive them away. "Leave now. If you keep causing trouble, don't blame me for using force." The burly security guard intimidated Bertram, who had no choice but to leave with his luggage and son. With no money, Bertram couldn't find a place to stay and ended up on the streets with his son, settling under a bridge for the night. As they endured until daybreak, young Barnaby suddenly developed a high fever. Feeling his son's burning forehead, Bertram finally panicked. "Barnaby, don't scare Daddy like this." He rushed his son to the hospital, only to receive the devastating news that Barnaby had developed myocarditis, and his congenital heart condition had worsened. He needed immediate hospitalization, and to fully recover, he would need a heart transplant which would cost £50,000 for the treatment. Bertram was stunned. He was now penniless. Where could he possibly get £50,000? "Doctor, please start treating my son. I'll gather the money quickly, I promise." Bertram's plea was pitiful, and the hospital agreed temporarily. He immediately went to Audrey Conroy's company, hoping to beg for her help. He knelt outside the company building, his hair disheveled, crying streams of tears. "Audrey, I was truly wrong. Please save Barnaby. We saved your life once. Remember?" He shouted hoarsely over and over, but Audrey never appeared. Finally, security guards rushed out, beat him, and threw him out of the company premises. Bertram lay on the roadside, utterly humiliated, and couldn't help but cry out, but it was all in vain. With nowhere else to turn, Bertram could only look for work. However, with his lack of education and work experience, the only way to earn money quickly was to venture into some gray areas of employment. He became a companion at a nightclub, but the money he earned each day could only buy Barnaby's daily medication. It would take an eternity to save up £50,000. As he hunched over the toilet, violently ill, Bertram felt the burning in his stomach and finally shed tears of regret. At that moment, he experienced a feeling worse than death itself. After leaving the hospital, Audrey immediately booked a flight to York. She wanted to find Alaric Faulkner and explain everything. She knew she had made a terrible mistake, and even if she had to beg on her knees, she wanted to try to win him back. This time, Audrey was more prepared. She even had Arthur Thornton find out Agatha Cornwell's exact address. But when she arrived at the community center and asked Agatha's neighbors, they told her, "Oh, you mean the Cornwells? They've gone out on a mission." Agatha's husband is quite impressive. He's a doctor and he became an army medic right away. Not like us, who have to stay behind. Audrey hadn't expected to miss them, but she still didn't want to give up. She quickly asked, "Do you know where they've gone for their mission?" The army wife shook her head. "It's all confidential missions, dear. We never know." With that, the woman left, leaving Audrey standing there alone for a long time. During this time, Alaric Faulkner had been traveling to many places with Agatha Cornwell, saving numerous lives. Their final destination was Chester, where the number of patients in the field hospital had increased dramatically due to terrorist threats. After joining the 2nd District Hospital, Alaric was performing surgeries almost every day. Agatha was busy carrying out her missions, and although the couple didn't see each other often, They would check in with each other on WhatsApp when they had the chance. In these busy days, Alaric felt that he and Agatha had developed an even closer connection. The feeling was deeper than friendship and more wonderful than romance. One day, after leaving the operating theater, Alaric suddenly received a call from Edinburgh. "Hello, is this Mr. Faulkner? I'm calling from Royal Westminster Hospital. Alicia Landers is critically ill. She hopes to see you one last time. Please come as soon as possible." The new mobile phone clattered to the ground, nearly shattering. Alaric Faulkner scrambled to pick it up, hastily speaking into it. "I'll be there as soon as possible. Please do your best to save her, and wait for me." By the end, Alaric's voice was choked with tears. Alicia Landers was Grandma Conroy's real name. How could Grandma suddenly be in critical condition? A familiar roaring seemed to echo in his ears. Alaric wiped his blurry eyes and hurried to his supervisor's office to request leave, then booked a flight back to Edinburgh. Throughout the journey, despite his exhaustion, Alaric couldn't sleep. His heart was in his throat, anxious and fretful, fearing he wouldn't see Grandma Conroy one last time. The passing of his grandmother had left him with regrets, and he dreaded the same outcome with Grandma Conroy. They were the two elders who loved him most in this world. After landing, Alaric took a taxi to the hospital. He sprinted all the way, reaching the VIP ward entrance. Not daring to waste a moment, he burst in. "Grandma!" Rushing to the bedside, Alaric's eyes were red, but he froze in the next second. Grandma Conroy was sitting up in bed, looking vibrant as she played Candy Crush, her rosy complexion hardly that of a patient. "Alaric's back," she said, smiling as she put down her phone and beckoned to him. Alaric walked over in a daze, sat by the bed, and carefully examined Grandma Conroy before sighing in relief. "So you're all right after all." At that moment, though aware he'd been tricked, Alaric felt only gratitude. He'd rather be led on by Grandma Conroy a few times than truly experience the death of another loved one. That kind of pain was a lifelong dampness, making one suffocate at the mere thought of it. The heaviness that had weighed on his heart throughout the return journey lifted, and Alaric felt much lighter. He looked at Grandma Conroy helplessly. "Grandma, you can tell me anything directly. Why did you have to scare me like this? When I heard you were critically ill, I was frightened to death." Seeing the dark circles under Alaric's eyes, Grandma Conroy guiltily stroked his hand. "The journey back must have worn you out. But Grandma had no choice. If I hadn't called you this time, would I ever see you again?" Hearing Grandma Conroy say this, Alaric lowered his head. He had changed his phone number and cut off previous contacts. But for Grandma Conroy, his actions had indeed hurt the old lady's feelings. Yet Grandma Conroy was Audrey's grandmother, and he truly didn't know how to face her anymore. His nose stinging fiercely, Alaric sniffled and said in a muffled voice, "I'm sorry, Grandma." After a soft sigh, a warm, large hand rested on Alaric's head. "Silly child, what are you apologizing to me for? Grandma knows it was that naughty Audrey who broke your heart. You've done nothing wrong. She's the one who didn't appreciate her blessings. But Grandma hopes you know that you're not an outsider to me. Even if you can't be my granddaughter-in-law, you're still my grandson." Hearing these words, Alaric could no longer hold back. He hugged Grandma Conroy and burst into tears. How could he not have long considered Grandma Conroy as his own grandmother? How could he bear to sever this familial bond? Grandma Conroy held Alaric, soothingly patting his back. When his emotions stabilized, she asked, "That wife of yours, is she good to you?" Alaric wasn't surprised that Grandma Conroy had found out about Agatha. He nodded. "She's a very good person and treats me well." Grandma Conroy, perceiving Alaric's thoughts, smiled and asked, "Do you like her?" Alaric blushed a bit but nodded solemnly. "I do." Grandma Conroy looked at him lovingly, stroking his face. "As long as you like her, she's the best. Grandma wants to attend the wedding too." Alaric's eyes glistened with tears as he nodded vigorously. "Of course!" As the atmosphere turned warm and tender, suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. Alaric! Audrey Conroy rushed into the hospital room, her eyes immediately welling up with tears as she saw Alaric Faulkner. "Alaric, you're back," she whispered. She looked as if she had been through a rough patch. Her cheeks were sunken, and her once strikingly beautiful face had lost its charm due to weight loss. Alaric frowned upon seeing Audrey. He had no desire to engage with her. Standing up, he turned to Mrs. Conroy and said, "Grandmother, I need to head back. I've only taken a few days off, and I have patients waiting for me." Mrs. Conroy nodded with a smile. "I'll have the driver take you. Do give me a ring before the wedding, dear." Alaric hugged his grandmother affectionately before getting ready to leave. His assistant, following close behind, said, "Mr. Faulkner, I'll arrange for the driver." Alaric nodded, walking past Audrey without so much as a glance in her direction. Audrey hurriedly stepped forward, attempting to grab his arm. "Alaric, I'm sorry. Please don't go." Mrs. Conroy's expression darkened. "Crispin, restrain Miss Conroy." As Audrey was held down by the security guard, she could only watch helplessly as Alaric walked away, her eyes red with emotion. She struggled against the guard's grip, shouting, "Alaric, don't leave me. Don't go." But Alaric left without even a backward glance. Once Alaric had disappeared from view, the security guard released his hold on Audrey. She immediately tried to rush after Alaric, but Mrs. Conroy's stern voice stopped her in her tracks. "Audrey Conroy, when will you let go?" Audrey paused, turning to face her grandmother with tear-filled eyes. "Grandmother, why didn't you tell me Alaric was back? He's my fiancé. How can I just stand by and watch him marry someone else? I'm going to win him back." Mrs. Conroy regarded Audrey coldly. "He was indeed your fiancé once, but you chose to give him up. He's married now." Audrey gritted her teeth. "I don't acknowledge that woman as his wife. She's inferior to me in every way. I will get Alaric back." Seeing her granddaughter's obsessive behavior, Mrs. Conroy sighed. "All you rely on is the Conroy family name. But let me tell you that Agatha Cornwell, her background is no less impressive than yours. She's the granddaughter of a senior military officer, and her uncle is the chairman of Faulkner Enterprises. The combined power of politics and business. Do you understand how formidable that is?" Audrey's face fell. "That time with the company." Mrs. Conroy nodded. "It was the Cornwell family's doing." Audrey's eyes flashed with resentment, but her expression turned despondent. If she couldn't even match Agatha's family background, how could she hope to win Alaric back? That very day, Alaric flew back to Chester. With 1 day left of his leave, he returned to his dormitory for a good night's sleep to adjust to the time difference before reporting back to work. Days passed, and Alaric kept himself busy with his routine. In his spare moments, he would exchange casual messages with Agatha. He'd share about his day, what he ate, what he saw, what kind of patients he treated. His messages were always met with a response. 1 or 2 messages a day, not much, but enough to provide a sense of comfort. Until one day, when Agatha didn't reply to Alaric's messages for a day and a half. This was unprecedented and definitely unusual. Alaric began to feel uneasy, but he tried to reassure himself that Agatha might be on a mission. After 48 hours of silence from Agatha, Alaric couldn't sit still any longer. Just as he was debating whether to call her, a young nurse from the A&E rushed in. "Dr. Faulkner, your wife Agatha Cornwell has been hit by a stray bullet. We need you to sign the consent form for surgery immediately." Alaric Faulkner ran alongside the young nurse, rushing towards the operating theater. When he saw Agatha Cornwell covered in blood inside the isolation room, his entire head began to throb. Agatha lay there, silent and still, seemingly without breath. As a doctor who dealt with life and death daily, he shouldn't have been afraid of blood. But at this moment, Alaric was terrified. He feared that Agatha, who would often tease him with a raised eyebrow and a mischievous grin, might be gone forever. Tears welled up instantly, and Alaric's body went numb, rendering him immobile. In the end, it was the young nurse who guided him through signing the surgical consent form. As he signed, his hand trembled so violently he could barely hold the pen. The red light above the operating theater lit up, and Alaric sat in the corridor, waiting. Usually, he was the one performing the operations. He had never known how agonizing the process could be for those waiting outside. An hour later, the surgery was over. When the operating theater doors opened, Alaric rushed forward like any ordinary family member would. The surgery had been performed by the most experienced consultant in the department, but Alaric still couldn't shake off his worry. Fortunately, as the surgeon removed his mask, he uttered the words that put Alaric's heart at ease. "Dr. Faulkner, your wife's surgery was successful. Now we just need to wait for her to regain consciousness." Alaric sighed in relief, thanked him, and then went to the ward to keep vigil. He gently wiped Agatha's hands and face, then sat by the bed, studying her pale, handsome face. When asleep, her face looked so proper and dignified, it seemed almost unfamiliar. He preferred when her eyes were open, with that hint of mischief that suited her so well. As Alaric gazed at her, lost in thought, his finger began to trace the contours of her eyebrows and eyes. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his wandering finger. "That tickles, darling," a hoarse voice exclaimed. Startled, Alaric looked down to see Agatha squinting at him, a smile playing on her lips. A lump formed in his throat, and he stared at her, dumbfounded. Agatha grew concerned. "What's wrong? Why are you suddenly crying? Come on, Alaric, be reasonable. You're the one disturbing a poor patient's rest, so why are you the one in tears?" she teased. Hearing Agatha's gentle chiding, Alaric couldn't help but smile through his tears. Ignoring how foolish he might look with a runny nose, he leaned down and carefully embraced her, whispering, "I'm so glad you're all right." Hearing this, Agatha's heart melted. She stroked his hair soothingly. There. Your wife is tough as old boots. I'm not going anywhere. Besides, if a stray bullet couldn't do me in, I'm certainly not about to let your worry finish the job." Alaric, hearing her casual mentions of death, pulled away from her embrace and gently pushed her shoulder. "Don't say such unlucky things." Agatha frowned and suddenly hissed in pain. Alaric immediately tensed, quickly standing up to check on her. "What's wrong? Did I hurt your wound?" To his surprise, Agatha's expression changed in an instant, and she smirked. "Got you." Alaric felt his heart nearly stop. Scowling, he made to leave. Agatha quickly grabbed his hand, shaking it as she apologized. I'm sorry. No more jokes. Okay?" Alaric, shaken by her antics, couldn't maintain his stern expression. He sat back down on the edge of the bed. Looking at Agatha, he spoke again, his tone serious. "Detective Cornwell, in the future, whether you're on duty or doing anything else, I hope you'll be more mindful of your safety. As your husband, I worry about you terribly. I know you have a duty to Queen and country, and you're not afraid to risk your life for it. But sometimes, I wish you'd be a bit more cautious, a little less fearless, because you have our little family to think of too." Alaric spoke these words softly and slowly. Though they lacked force, they wrapped around Agatha's heart like fine threads. She stared at him, then suddenly called out loudly, "Reporting for duty, sir." Alaric jumped, startled. "What are you doing?" Agatha grinned and leaned in close. "Requesting permission to kiss, sir." Alaric's face reddened slightly, his eyes widening as he leaned back. "Permission den MMPH." For the following week, Agatha Cornwell lived in absolute bliss. Her husband was her attending physician, allowing her to spend every day close to him and admire his professional demeanor at work. Life couldn't get any better. As she gazed out the window, she couldn't help but think that she should have gotten injured sooner. That day, after the usual rounds, Alaric Faulkner opened the door to find Agatha looking at him with sparkling eyes, like a kitten waiting for its owner's affection. He approached the bedside and looked at her with resignation. "What is it?" Agatha raised an eyebrow and pointed to her lips. "You haven't given me my good morning kiss yet." Alaric couldn't resist her playful charm but maintained a stern face. "I'm working now. Lift your shirt. I need to change your dressing." Agatha muttered heartless man, but complied, lifting her shirt without further fuss. Alaric efficiently changed the dressing. Glancing up to see her still pouting, he chuckled softly and leaned in to kiss the corner of her mouth. As he was about to straighten up, a pair of arms wrapped firmly around his neck, and her lips claimed his in a passionate kiss that took his breath away. When they parted, Alaric found himself aroused by this temptress. He could only rest his forehead on Agatha's shoulder to catch his breath. The air was thick with intimacy as the couple embraced quietly. Suddenly, an ill-timed shout shattered the moment. "What are you doing?" Alaric turned to see Audrey Conroy rushing in from the doorway. Almost instinctively, he moved to shield Agatha, frowning at Audrey. "What are you doing here?" Audrey seemed hurt by Alaric's protective stance. With reddened eyes, she asked, "Alaric, do you cherish her that much?" "Of course," Alaric replied coldly. "She's my wife, my family, and my love. I won't allow anyone to harm her." Each word felt like a bullet to Audrey's heart. She trembled. Her voice pained as she asked, "Alaric, what about me? What am I to you? We've been together for 20 years. Alaric's expression remained unchanged as he stated flatly, "You were once important to me, but that's in the past. Now you're just Mrs. Conroy's granddaughter to me." Audrey's heart filled with resentment. She pleaded, "Alaric, I truly regret my actions. I've sent Bertram Cargill back to Westminster. Please, give me another chance. I'm begging you, just one more chance." Alaric looked at her impatiently, about to speak, but Agatha wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his shoulder. With a smirk, she said, "I'm sorry, Miss Conroy, but I don't agree with you joining our family. You're not even qualified to be the other woman." Seeing Agatha's smug expression, Audrey's eyes flashed with anger. She lunged forward to attack her. At that moment, security guards burst in from outside, quickly subduing Audrey and dragging her out. These guards hadn't been visible earlier. Audrey suddenly realized this was Agatha's scheme. As she struggled, she shouted, "Alaric, she's just a manipulative person. She deliberately let me in." Alaric watched Audrey expressionlessly. "Even if she's manipulative, I still like her. And even if you were honest and upright, I'd still dislike you." Audrey seemed to lose all her strength in an instant. She stopped struggling and was quickly removed by the guards. The room fell silent. Alaric folded his arms and turned to Agatha. "Was that deliberate?" Agatha looked everywhere but at him, even whistling innocently. After a while, seeing Alaric still staring at her, Agatha finally gave in. She shrugged and said, "All right, I did it on purpose. She's just so annoying." "But, did you mean what you said earlier?" Alaric knew exactly what she meant but pretended to be clueless. "What?" Agatha leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "About liking me even if I'm manipulative." Alaric chuckled. "That was a lie." "Humph, I don't believe you. Tell me something true then." Alaric looked into Agatha's eyes and said softly, "After you're discharged, come meet my parents with me." After being discharged from the hospital, Alaric Faulkner took Agatha Cornwell back to Edinburgh. Alaric's parents were buried in York Cemetery. To reach the cemetery, one could take the cable car or climb the stone steps. The weather was nice that day, and Alaric was in a good mood. He suddenly had an idea. "Why don't we climb up?" Agatha raised an eyebrow. "Whatever you say, darling." Hand in hand, they started climbing the stone steps together. They chatted about childhood memories along the way, breathing in the fresh air. Alaric hadn't felt this relaxed in a long time. Agatha looked at him lovingly, holding his arm and listening quietly. After 40 minutes of climbing, they reached the top, and the cemetery gates appeared before them. Alaric stood still for a moment, examining the surroundings, before taking Agatha's hand and slowly walking forward. It had been a long time since he'd visited his parents' graves, and Alaric thought he might not be able to find them. But sometimes, as if guided by some unseen force, he wandered aimlessly and quickly found his parents' tombstones. It had rained a few days ago, and the photos on the tombstones were foggy. Just as Alaric was about to wipe off the dirt with his hand, Agatha knelt down beside him and patiently cleaned the photos. Alaric's heart melted. He crouched in front of his parents' tombstones, smiling with teary eyes. "Dad, Mum, I've brought your daughter-in-law. I remember, Dad, you used to say you liked proper military men the most. Well, she's a soldier. Not a military brother, but a military sister. You must be more than satisfied with this daughter-in-law, right?" Agatha crouched beside Alaric, seeing his smile but noticing the sorrow in his eyes. Her heart ached. She had specially worn new clothes today but didn't mind dirtying them. She knelt firmly on both knees in front of the tombstones. After bowing 3 times to Alaric's parents, Agatha solemnly said, "Dad, Mum, thank you for raising such a wonderful son. Being married to Alaric is a blessing I must have earned in a past life. Promises are cheap, so I won't make any. I'll just act. I'll give my all and do my utmost to be good to Alaric. Please entrust your son to me with peace of mind." After paying their respects to Alaric's parents, they slowly walked back down the hill. Alaric's heart was swelling with emotion from Agatha's vow. He couldn't help but look at the woman beside him and ask, "You said you'd do your utmost to be good to me. How exactly?" Agatha smiled. "Just with all my might, that's all. How can I explain? You'll see in the future." Alaric seemed to realize his question was a bit silly and fell silent. They walked down quietly. Agatha, looking at Alaric's profile, deliberately nudged him with her elbow and asked carefully, "What's wrong? Are you upset?" Alaric shook his head and smiled. "You're treating me like a little girl. How could I get upset so easily?" Agatha didn't believe him. Looking at the downhill path, she had an idea. "Hey, come on. I'll carry you down." Alaric was surprised. "No way. I'm a grown man. I'm too heavy." "What's your weight compared to what I carry? During field training, I carry twice your weight. Come on, get on." Alaric couldn't argue with Agatha and climbed onto her back. It was his first time being carried by a woman, and Alaric confirmed that Agatha wasn't just showing off. He settled down. With his face against Agatha's neck, the scenery retreated beside them, but he felt no jostling at all. His heart felt secure yet swollen with emotion. Alaric closed his eyes and said softly, "Agatha, thank you." Agatha chuckled and teased, "This is thousands of steps. You know, Dr. Faulkner is a simple thank you all I get. You're quite the bargainer." "Well, what kind of thanks do you want?" Agatha spoke with a smile in her voice. "Report." Alaric curled his lips. "Speak. Request permission to marry." "Granted." July 22nd. A perfect day for weddings according to the Gregorian calendar. This day marked Alaric Faulkner's birthday and, coincidentally, his wedding day. Agatha Cornwell's task had come to an end, and with Mrs. Quinton's support for Alaric, the wedding wasn't as modest as initially planned. Instead, it was the epitome of luxury. The Colton Hotel, York's largest, was entirely booked for the wedding reception. Fresh flowers, flown in from all corners, transformed the venue into a sea of roses. In the waiting area, Alaric had changed into his bespoke white suit. His slightly long hair was neatly slicked back, making him look every bit the Prince Charming. Alaric gazed at his reflection in the glass, feeling no regret, only anticipation for the family he was about to build. Soon, he would have a real home of his own, not just a place where he was a guest. The host began to cue the proceedings. Alaric took his position, but there was no sign of Agatha at the entrance. Moments later, a young usher rushed in, whispering to the host, "Stall for time. The bride hasn't arrived yet." Mrs. Quinton, seated on the groom's side, looked displeased. Mr. Quinton, leaning on his cane, began to worry and quickly sent someone to find Agatha. The guests noticed the delay and began to murmur amongst themselves, creating a buzz of confusion. Through it all, Alaric remained calm on the stage. Suddenly, the doors swung open, but instead of Agatha, it was Audrey Conroy who entered. She had clearly put effort into her appearance, wearing a white wedding gown as if she were the bride. "Alaric, Agatha is late to her own wedding. It's clear she doesn't truly care for you, Audrey said, extending her hand towards Alaric. Don't marry her. Come with me instead. This attempt to hijack the wedding caused an uproar among the guests. Mr. Quinton, furious, stood up. What do you think you're doing, young lady? Trying to steal my granddaughter's wedding. Bronte, Bryony, help your cousin and get this woman out of here, he commanded. Two young women in bridesmaid dresses immediately rushed forward, grabbing Audrey's arms and dragging her towards the exit. Audrey struggled, desperately calling out to Alaric. Alaric, believe me, I truly love you. I'll be good to you, I'll change my ways. Please, trust me. Alaric finally spared her a glance, speaking coolly. Miss Conroy, my wife once said that promises are cheap. Don't just speak, act. Give your all. Do your utmost to be good to someone. That's what love is. You've done nothing. How can you claim to love me? Audrey gritted her teeth, her eyes filled with resentment as she shouted back. What about Agatha then? What has she done that could be called loving you? Alaric couldn't be bothered to respond, but at that moment, a voice rang out. Oh, I've just arrived with proof of my love. Alaric looked up to see Agatha standing there. Her appearance was stunning. Instead of a traditional wedding gown, she wore a strapless top paired with white trousers, topped with a long bridal veil. She looked both fierce and beautiful, captivating everyone's attention. Agatha strode quickly to Alaric, holding a document. She said softly, Did I keep you waiting, my handsome groom? Alaric chuckled. I wasn't impatient, but the guests are eager to start the meal. No one wants to hear our love declarations. All right, I'll make this quick then. Agatha smiled wryly, handing the document to Alaric. She spoke solemnly. I know you once devoted yourself to someone, giving everything and receiving nothing in return, wasting your youth. When the winds changed, you ended that relationship. Today, you're entrusting your life to me again. It's a big gamble, and I don't want you to lose. I don't like making promises, so this is my way of giving my all. Alaric opened the document, his eyes widening as he read. Agatha patiently explained, I've investigated the accident that killed your parents. Your uncle and his wife were directly involved. This evidence has been submitted to the courts. By now, they should be in custody. Alaric looked at Agatha in disbelief, his eyes brimming with tears. She had undertaken such a dangerous investigation alone. In the next moment, he embraced her tightly. Agatha seemed to be smiling, her chest trembling slightly as she whispered in his ear, That day you asked me what it means to do one's utmost for someone. This is my answer. Are you satisfied, husband? Alaric was speechless, only able to nod vigorously. In his heart he was shouting, I love you.